Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining our Adapt to a New Normal webinar. We've got a great session ahead of us today. Just a few things before we start. There will be a Q&A at the end, so please do drop any questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you haven't already seen the Adapt report, don't worry, we'll be sharing afterwards along with the slides and the recording. Let me introduce you to our wonderful speakers. Today we are joined by Morgan Crosby, Global Growth Leader at AIRINC. Morgan is a seasoned professional with more than 20 years of global mobility experience. She has supported companies across all industries. Morgan is responsible for the strategic intersection of marketing, business development, and product development. She ensures AIRINC solutions meet client needs today and in the future. We're also joined by Matt Morgan, Chief People Officer at Big Panda, the market leader in event correlation and automation. Matt leads the people team at Big Panda. He previously led the people function at Blend, a fintech scale-up, as well as Pandora. Matt spent the first 10 years of his career as a recruiter working at startups in the Bay Area before becoming a business partner at Nielsen. We also have Topia own Jacky Cohen. Jacky leads people and culture at Topia, overseeing the employee experience and global people operations from the moment a candidate applies and throughout their journey as a Topia employee. Prior to joining Topia, Jacky led HR teams and scaled the people functions in a variety of roles during hypergrowth stages at both Pandora and Lyft. Finally, we have Steve Black, Topia co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer. Steve leads strategic and product initiatives leveraging deep industry technology and customer insight. An expat himself, originally from the US, Steve understands the challenges of moving abroad and is dedicated to making it easier for companies and individuals to work everywhere. Steve, I'll hand over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Holly, for the kind introduction and getting things started off today. Welcome, everyone. Excited to have you with us today for an interesting and exciting conversation, I hope. We're here today to talk about the changing world of work. At Topia, we run an annual survey called Adapt, and we ran that 2020 version right before COVID became a household name. We ran the 21 version late December, early January of this year. And so actually have a pretty unique snapshot of how employee perceptions, how HR mindset, and a few other interesting bits have changed over the last year plus. From a demographic point of view, the survey covered 1,250 employees across the US and the UK, really focused on large enterprises with 2,500 or more employees, and really focused on that sort of knowledge worker contingent that had pre-pandemic predominantly worked at a desk in an office setting from an overall perspective. So today we're going to talk around this new world of work, what that means for what employees want, and dig in a bit around the new risks that are emerging along the way. Please, as Holly mentioned, chime in with questions. We're going to save some time at the end for Q&A submitted through the tool. And with that, I will dig in and get us started here. So the new world of work is a term we're probably all feeling maybe getting a little bit overused at this point, but we wanted to dig in a bit around what exactly is that. I think when the pandemic first broke, there was a lot of conversation around this shift to remote being temporary, back when we optimistically thought maybe, COVID would be done in a few months' time. But I think it's clear that it is here to stay in terms of flexible and remote working. So a few interesting results from the survey to share, and then we'll dig into the conversation. So first off, 91% of the employees surveyed said that they should be able to work wherever they want as long as they get their work done. I think in a way, something we've all proven is possible over the last year, but maybe we haven't thought about the implications of working from a beach or a ski chalet. 94% of HR teams say remote work supports a more diverse team. D&I initiatives have obviously been a big topic for many, many years. So exciting to hear more about how this can support those. 83% of employees surveyed agreed a team should be built on experience and skill set, not location. So some interesting opportunities for us to tap in talent pools in other markets, perhaps that we haven't previously considered. And last, and this is actually a stat from AIRINC's Future of Remote Work survey, 86% of companies expect an increase in remote working requests or arrangements. So it's clear that it is here to stay and going to create challenges and opportunities, I think, for all of us. So to kick us off, Matt, obviously, from Holly's intro, you've got deep experience leading people functions. What are you seeing as it relates to this new world of work in your role at Big Panda?
Yeah, I mean, so Big Panda, our engineering and product and design is all in Israel, but our entire go-to-market team is in the US. And so we previously were very focused on specific markets, and we're now really opening it up and looking for the best talent wherever we can get it. And I think, frankly, the hiring in tech companies is so hard that especially doing it in the same place, like all this data makes so much sense to me, because it's too hard to compete against Facebook every day by hiring in the Bay Area all the time.
Absolutely. No, and Morgan, I guess from your perspective, obviously you're seeing this shift across a number of organizations and your clients. How are you seeing them prepare for this new normal?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, companies are really eager to put in place policies that govern flexible work requests, and that is above and beyond the work from home policy, right? The work from home policy is a global policy about a domestic arrangement where your payroll is sitting. But then on top of that, we have the request to work from anywhere. And that could either be domestically or internationally. So companies are eager to put in place the policies for that. And policies, not traditional, like, will I pay for this or not? It's also, when would I approve this? When is it acceptable? And when is that something that we would consider? And often, companies have a lot of, look to say, I want to make sure that I have an entity there, that I'm not going to create PE risks. So they want to put all that in place. But once they get that in place, the next thing they're starting to think about is, oh my goodness, how am I going to track all of these requests? And how am I going to track where these people are? So the policy work is sort of in play, done, or almost done. Now we're starting to see companies turn to, well, how do I keep track of all of this, and how do I put the infrastructure in place to manage all of this going forward? So companies are really actively pursuing all of those things.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that. It's almost in many cases the sort of headline from maybe the CEO, maybe ahead of the rest of the organization, and work from anywhere, asterisk, where we say you can. So a lot of work to be done on that front. And Jacky, as an HR leader, how are you thinking about policies for that new world of work? Not just the work from anywhere policy, but obviously it runs the gamut and changes the way in which we interact with employees across the board.
Yeah, I think that it's forcing us to think about policies differently. Me personally, sometimes policy and flexibility those are two can be contradictory ways of thinking. So I think what it's forcing us to do as HR, and a little bit further to Morgan's point, is rather than say, here's what you can do and be very black and white around it, it forces us to think about, here as an employer, here's what we can do right now. Here's what we have to offer. Here's where we have entities. Here's where we are already set up to employ you, legally and compliantly. If that doesn't work for you, then let's have a conversation about what's next and how maybe we can work with your arrangement. So I think in some cases, that's not always going to be possible and scalable to have an individual conversation with everyone, which is where technology comes into play and making sure that we're set up to do that tracking bit. But I do think it's forcing us to think a little bit differently around, rather than here's black and white what we can do or what you can do. It's here's what we can do as the employer, and let's engage in a conversation to make sure that we're supporting all of our employees.
No, that makes sense. And maybe just to double click on this, the second point, the 94% side, and Matt or Jacky, feel free to chime in. This this topic of remote and diversity is one that I think is really intriguing and interesting to me. So would love perspectives, from an HR leader point of view, how you think about this new world of work and tapping into potentially more diverse pools. Matt, maybe it's obviously there's potentially cost savings versus competing in a siloed area, but diversity as well. What's your thought there on how
I want to say, I actually don't know that it's a cost savings. It's just like the ability to compete, right? Like, right. So the ability about shifting is not, for us at least, we're often paying close to Bay Area salaries. I think that's a whole other piece of like, how do you manage, salary management across geos and things like that, I think is really, is a hard problem to solve. But I mean, regardless, I've been working in tech companies in the Bay Area for 20 years. Like, you're going after the same pool of people flow in and out, but it's the same pool. And so just by, if I open up to going to Sacramento, that changes my pool and broadens it. And so, and there's lots of people who are qualified to work at tech companies, but they just don't happen to live in a tech hub. And that shouldn't matter anymore. They're tech companies.
Yeah, I agree. I think just even the ability to open up slightly unlocks a whole new talent pool. And actually, back to the cost savings, sometimes it can actually be more expensive because you're taking longer, you're being more intentional, you're working with specific partners. So it's exactly what we need to be doing. But I think cost savings is actually off the table here as far as that discussion goes.
Great. No, and I think that sort of point of opening up and widening the net as it is ties nicely to the next topic we wanted to dig into, is around what are employees actually looking for, and what is driving a great employee experience. So this is one of those questions that we looked at both before and after, excuse me, COVID. And I think what we've seen here is some maybe surprising, some unsurprising. So the ability for growth and the opportunities there continue to be top priority for individuals. The way in which they describe or that growth manifests itself, whether it's training, job rotations, international assignments, growth is the key, and that's grown 5 points year on year. Interestingly, and perhaps counterintuitively at first, but when you look at it a little bit deeper, the priority and focus on empowerment and trust has fallen year over year. In large part, I think we're all trusted these days, whether we like it or not, because we're working at home behind closed doors, and literally nobody can look over our shoulder. So perhaps it has saved some of the micromanager or other challenges that folks have faced. Having the right tech continues to be high ranking and important, relatively flat year on year. Flexibility for location has grown year on year, probably unsurprisingly given the conversations. And then at the bottom of the list was amazing office spaces and perks. Again, no surprise given how many of us aren't in the office these days, but I think does beg some interesting questions around what that looks like as we go forward. I guess, Morgan, maybe to call on you first. Any surprises here for you in terms of what employees consider making a great experience?
I think what's really fascinating in the stats, and also in the stats AIRINC has been collecting, is we all thought because of the pandemic that employees would be reluctant to want to take international assignments, but that's actually not the case. We are seeing that employees want more experience and varied experience. And now that we know that, distributed workforce is something that's in the future, perhaps taking an assignment isn't the risk that it used to be for your career, to be out of sight, out of mind. And, the fact that we're seeing an increase in employees wanting to have growth opportunities and international experiences during what is maybe a challenging time to be abroad or away from your family is really something I don't think we were expecting, and really telling about people's curiosity and desire to do new and different things. And our survey, we did a mobility outlook survey in 2021, and 60% of companies said they think that they will have about the same or even a bit more interest from employees to go on international assignment in 2021. So, you know, we've been thinking that COVID has throttled the ability to be abroad, but actually people want to get new experiences and they want to be in different places. So I think the explosion of people working in really disparate and different places is going to happen.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting one. I was speaking with some folks recently, and part of the hypothesis was also this, you know, we've proven in a way that we can stay connected to our networks on a personal and family basis without physical interaction, right? I live 10 minutes away from our in-laws, who, you know, we've seen very limited over the course of this pandemic, right? And so in a way, some of the benefits of having them around the corner are a bit lessened, but also I think, you know, we're comfortable and confident that if we went to Germany for a couple of years, right, we could maintain those networks and actually we can get a lot done even on a personal basis on the Zoom side of things as well. So yeah, I think absolutely an interesting trend and exciting, and I think positive to see how that continues. Jacky, one I wanted to dig in on is the office space side of things. So obviously it's been a tough year for offices, but I think we've also seen lots of folks with some interest in being back in the office part-time when it's safe. What's your thought on, you know, what the future of the office looks like as we come out of the other side of this pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's going to fall in the same trends that we were talking about on the prior slide around flexibility. I think people are going to want options, and they are going to be looking to their employer to accommodate that. So I really don't think the office is going away. There were a lot of conversations around, again, people have demonstrated their ability to work from anywhere. Is this permanent? Should we get rid of office leases altogether? I think it's going to come down to people's personal situations. There are a lot of people that are looking to get back into an office space because their home situation isn't exactly ideal for work, or maybe they're not looking to go back full time. Maybe they're just looking to go back a few days a week. So my vision is it's going to be something like hot desks, collaboration spaces, potentially even rotating where your office is located within a certain city or a certain state, right? So it's not this stagnant desk and space that you're going to every day. It's just going to look differently. And I don't think that on the flip side, employers are going to necessarily require people to be back in the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, potentially some may, but it's going to be really challenging to do that after the year we've had. And again, that's all going to be dependent on the business and the person, but I think it's going to go back to flexibility being key here.
Definitely. And Matt, from your point of view, obviously, regardless of what offices end up looking like, there's going to be a big part of our organization that is not in the office most of the time, or at least much of the time. You know, how do you think about employee experience and how organizations and HR needs to adapt to deliver a great experience without so many of the personal touches and interactions that we become used to with time in the office?
Yeah. So I think, you know, obviously that middle piece there, the 40% around having the right tech, we have to leverage the tools that are out there to sort of build digital community. So, you know, I think that, like for us at Big Panda, that's going to be some form of digital town square, right? We spend, you know, at some ability to communicate to employees what's happening, what's going on, to create a shared space. So like in most of our office life, the shared space is, you know, you come in the morning through the lobby, we would put messaging there. We would, you know, like there's a, you know, if you're in HR and way you're in marketing, right? You're marketing to employees all the time. And so now we just have to shift that online, and then we have to find ways to adapt things. And so, you know, we put in this program at Big Panda that I've done at the last couple of companies I've been at, which is, you know, an employee engagement initiative. And we, you know, made it so that if they're doing things virtually, they can get this funding that the company is going to give them to connect. You know, if we're turning that into an online thing, where as previously it's, you know, soccer teams and, you know, all these other things that we would sponsor in person, we're just moving that online. And I think that employees are ready for it.
Yeah, that's great. And Jacky, how have you thought about this to this point around employee engagement? Obviously, the last year has been an interesting one. How have you thought about designing or redesigning things on the employee engagement front in this highly virtual world?
Yeah, it's all about communication. I think, and it's a lot, there's a big component of this around manager enablement. I think there is so much, to Matt's point, there's engagement and bits that can come from the HR team, but if we're really trying to do this at scale, there is definitely needs to be a focus on the managers, the people that are interacting with every employee every day. It can't just come from from HR or the most level of senior leadership. So we've put a very intentional focus on our management level and working with them a lot on a lot of these softer skills. What tools and things can they leverage? How do we drive even more empathy in the organization? Because we really don't know what's going on in every person's life outside the door of the Zoom room they're in, right? So that's been a big focus for us to make sure, again, that each experience for each employee is unique and we're not trying to drive kind of a one size fits all program.
Yeah, I think that line managers have always been important, but I think this just highlights the good from the bad as well, right? A great line manager can rally and engage a remote team, and one that's been struggling is going to continue to struggle and perhaps have even bigger challenges. So a critical piece of the puzzle. Another topic which we dug into as we ran across the survey, and it was sort of 50-50 split male female from the responses, was looking at, okay, how are we seeing the sort of perception, preferences, and realities change, and what is that? How does that tie to the stories we're hearing around the impact of COVID on women in the workforce? And so one of the things we talked about, and from a survey perspective, we had individuals rank and rate relative priorities, right? How important is flexibility to work remotely? How important is professional development? So some slight changes for COVID and some that have been on the survey for some time now. And Morgan, to your prior point, this willingness and interest in moving abroad. So I think, Jacky, one of the things, I know we've talked about a bit internally at Topia, and it'd be great to get your thoughts here around is, how do you see this flexible working, supporting women? And, on the other end of the spectrum, we've heard a lot about how many women are leaving the workforce over the course of the pandemic. How do we sort of square those two? We're finally in a bit more of a remote world, but it hasn't maybe had the impact that we'd hoped. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. It's so sad to me that the disproportion of women leaving the workforce due to the pandemic, and specifically, just worth noting, it's especially in the U.S., mainly women of color, right? Mm-hmm. And again, I don't want to try and oversimplify what has gone into this and the impact and job loss, but a lot of it boiled down initially to the hardest hit sectors, right? So education, hospitality, retail, and the ability to manage childcare. So I think that there is a lot bigger than just what an employer can do, right? There are systemic and societal changes that need to happen so that childcare isn't disproportionately falling on women rather than men. But I think from an employer perspective, focus on controlling what we can control and driving change. To me, and Steve, you've heard me say this, I actually fundamentally don't believe in creating policies for women. To me, that feels contradictory to inclusivity and what we're trying to do. I believe in creating policies for people and making sure that those policies are inclusive for every type of person that needs it. And again, it goes back to this flexibility piece around what do we have the ability to do right now, and if that's not working for someone, making sure our managers are enabled as well to have the conversations and navigate through what can we do potentially. So, there are some low-hanging fruit around flexible working hours, potentially blocking family time for people, whatever their family looks like, but enabling them to manage their own schedules, supporting childcare if that's financially feasible for a company, creating parents groups or family groups internally, and just bringing communities together. So again, I think there's some low-hanging fruit there. I think there's a lot bigger issues here, but it's what can we do and what do people need in order for them to be individually supported in their own personal needs.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We were talking a little bit in the green room before we went live around this. sort of humanization that at times Zoom can do, right? And where I've seen leaders, take advantage of that, and we talked about one of our leaders having his child on a lap during a conference call, and I think normalizing some of those behaviors of, hey, I'm going to block these 2 hours because I'm doing bedtime tonight, right? Like, and working around that schedule is a real opportunity for folks to step forward and show that's okay and that's to be expected. And I think in the absence of that, it's very easy for folks to get overwhelmed and feel like they have to somehow pretend that real life isn't happening, on the other side of that door at times. Matt, one for you. How are you thinking about this? Sort of managing different needs across the population, as we return to work. And one thing that I've heard, some folks having some anxiety around with this point about flexibility is there a risk we end up in a world where, predominantly men return to office and predominantly women take advantage of this flexible and remote working world? What does that do to sort of, it almost feels opposite to what we want to achieve of having the right mixes, but any thoughts around whether that you think that's a real risk, and more broadly, how you're thinking about this sort of managing through this going forward?
So I guess a couple of things. One, I really agree with what Jacky said, which is, to build for everyone. And so I don't think, I don't perceive that this gap that is shown here, I think the men who are answering this are not, that they're thinking in a world that does not exist anymore. And so I think frankly, based on this, I think the women are not surprisingly smarter about this in this moment. And I think what's going to end up happening is that, again, people are going to have more opportunity. They're going to go where the good work is, where the good environment is. And I agree wholeheartedly with normalizing, I have 4 kids. My kids are, often just running into conference calls, and things like that. And you think about that video 5 years ago or whatever, that people are like, oh my goodness, he was on TV. And now that is normal. And I think that is really powerful. I've always been really open about my family, but I do that from a place of privilege. And I don't think that everybody can do that. But I think that this and the COVID has changed that. Yeah,
absolutely. And Morgan, one of the things you talked about earlier on was this good progress has been made in some dimension around this world of policy design. Now we're starting to get into the questions of, okay, how do we actually implement and roll out? And if I pair that with the fact that even pre-pandemic, particularly right in the traditional mobility world, there have been lots of conversations over the years around how do we get a more diverse talent pool into mobility, right? How do we make sure that the mix of who's on assignment isn't just, senior, older white men, right, in many organizations. And so, I guess, how are you seeing the design of programs and policies now in this more flexible, fungible world of work, and a more maybe shifting definition of mobility, trying to factor in that sort of imbalance from the past and make sure we don't see that going forward?
Sure. I call this, the period that we're in, the end of the policy, right? Policies were created in large part to say no, right? They weren't created to say yes. Right. And so they were to protect the company against employees abusing whatever the company was trying to do. And now we need to default to yes in our policies so that we're empowering people to to take assignments, to have opportunities. And that means taking all of the prescriptive bias that we have out of our policies, right? If you read some global mobility policies or HR policies, there's a person in mind that they're thinking about when they wrote that policy, whether they meant to do it or not, right? It's there. And so we need to take a step back and say, let's design this from, multiple different personas so that could work for different individuals. And when we do that, what we don't want to end up with is a policy that tries to think about everything that each individual person needs, because we could never imagine every little thing that the employee could potentially need or their family might need, right? Because when we're talking about an international assignment, now we're also talking about the family being involved. And so policies are now being designed with flexibility in mind and with that prescriptive bias taken out. And that's what we need to do in order to be approachable for all the different individuals or people, as Jacky says, that we're trying to send on an assignment. And of course, that leads to infrastructure changes, having the right technology to manage these more flexible programs, having more empathetic counselors that are helping with someone's move to make sure they can listen and understand people's needs. So we're really shifting from this doctor no policy to this, default to yes, and let's embrace different ways that we can empower people to take assignments or work and have new opportunities.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it certainly also sort of highlights the need to shift. And I think it's been a big driver of what we've seen in technology investment over the years, right? Of, okay, for far too long, many mobility and HR teams have been bogged down in administration rather than actually the reason most people got into mobility and HR, which was the people side of the puzzle, right? And so if we can start to automate away and streamline and integrate, the flow of information so that it's less time keying in data and actually more time thinking about that personal circumstance, guiding to a good outcome, identifying risk of somebody who maybe is unhappy and making a change before things go south. I think we'll continue to see that pressure because, as you say, that like there's a real nuance required and a personal touch required, I think, to get a lot of this right. And policy alone on paper, isn't going to cut it. So the next topic we wanted to spend a little bit of time on here today was the risks emerging as we find ourselves in this continued world of remote and flexible work. So one of the things we dug into from a survey perspective was trying to understand where employees had been working over the course of 2020, really post the start of COVID. And across the US and the UK, the populations we served, 28% had worked in another state or another country over the course of the pandemic, which was probably a bit higher than I expected, to be honest, given how much of the period borders had been closed and it was hard to even move around, but insightful for sure. And the sort of potentially even more interesting piece of the puzzle was that only 33% of those folks that had worked in a different jurisdiction had actually reported that back to their employers. To dig in that a little bit, Matt, you sort of talked when we chatted previously around an experience you had in the past, pre-COVID life around an organization, be very mindful about where employees were to avoid sort of tax implications. And so wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, but also how that sort of translates to this new world where employees literally could be anywhere.
Yeah, and I am one of these people who went and worked somewhere else and didn't report it. So this slide really hits home for me. We went and spent some time in Martha's Vineyard at the start of the pandemic to get out of New York. And so, listen, and at a startup, my previous startup, we were we didn't have geographic sales. So we were very focused on sort of key financial clients. So we were really narrow about where we hired. And, that's great. We didn't want to go open up states. There's all these tax rules and all that kind of stuff. It gets very quickly, I think that doesn't work anymore, as we've talked about in the previous slides and in the previous conversation. That doesn't really work anymore. And so now I definitely, in my HR role, have concern about how I'm going to manage this with, going forward, because I want to provide that level of flexibility. So we're going to start there and then work our way back to how do we do that.
Right. Yeah, and we've certainly seen, with customers out in the market, there's been interesting, almost not quite opposing, but very different ends of the spectrum driving some work and focus in the space. One end of the spectrum has been, of course, compliance concerns, right? So the last thing anybody wants is to fail an audit, to get a fine, to have somebody stopped at a border, the set of headline grabbing problems. On the other side, we saw this with this shift overnight to remote work. Actually, a number of organizations starting to take advantage of the tax savings opportunity that can come with that. So, particularly hedge funds, asset managers that are based in New York, now their employees are in Connecticut, Jersey, or somewhere else, could be millions at stake from a tax optimization point of view, because you don't have to pay tax necessarily if the employees are working somewhere else. Similarly, we've seen folks in San Francisco, LA, Seattle, a number of major cities around the US where surprise, surprise, nobody's coming into the city, and actually, your tax bill may be due based on where people are. But of course, you've got to be able to prove to the tax man when he comes calling that employees were sort of where they were. So that's certainly been a big driver of interest as well. Morgan, one of the things I saw in the recent AIRINC survey you noted was around this big expectation, right, that remote work policies and events and desires are on the rise. How are you seeing folks, designing that with this sort of location footprint in mind? Is it a green list of states and countries? Is it, on a case-by-case basis? What's been the evolution there as you've been talking with organizations?
Sure. I mean, the biggest desire is to try to gate the ability to work from anywhere to locations where the company has an entity already, so that the company can mitigate any risk around compliance or PE or that type of thing. So a lot of companies have been out building their lists of entities, and not only entities, but what job functions are possible in those entities. And they use that list as a way to approve a request to work from anywhere. And that's the first test you have to pass is, do we have an entity there? Does your function exist in that entity? And so they're looking to try to gate it towards those situations. We do have some really forward-thinking companies and companies that are really embracing working from anywhere, that are thinking about establishing global employment companies and other things like that, so that this becomes less of an issue. But I would say those are definitely the exception. And not the rule. And also we have companies that are in two camps: those that embrace working from anywhere and want to try to promote it, and those that are trying to be those Dr. No people that only tolerate it because of the thing you have here on this slide, the fear of not knowing where the people are, the fear of being compliant, and trying to rein that in as much as possible. And I had a tech company tell me the other day, I don't want to be like the professional services companies, and every time you log onto your computer, you have to tell me where you are. And I think that, we need to get beyond some of that, because this fear is standing in the way of us having a truly distributed workforce, which is what people are demanding. And if we don't go in that direction, we won't be an employer of choice. So we need to go there, and we need to figure this out. So we need to get rid of our fear that this is a problem and more of an opportunity.
Yeah, I think that Big Brother fear is one that's gotten a lot of press and media play, and it's an interesting one, because that sort of conjures images, at least in my head, right, of somebody sort of logging keystrokes on my keyboard. Did I take 5 minutes out of the day to check Facebook, or look at my kid's school schedule for that matter. And we dug in a little bit from a survey perspective into this topic of Big Brother, and I think what we found was great to see. If a bit surprising, is at least in this context of tracking from a compliance point of view, most employees aren't actually scared of Big Brother in this case. So what we asked is, as we dug in here, and this was across all employees, whether or not they'd worked across a different jurisdiction during the year, was, are you comfortable with your employer tracking your working location at different levels of granularity, right? So if you think about a big Google map and sort of zooming in as you go, first it was 95% of people were comfortable with their employer tracking them at the country level. Stayed at 95 when you went down to the state, went down only to 94, but still incredibly high tracking at the city level. So am I in London or San Francisco or New York? And then even 81% down to the specific street level, of where I am at a given time of day. And I think, from a compliance perspective, in most cases, or in many cases across Europe, certainly, a country level is sufficient. In the US, generally a state level is sufficient, and you have a handful of course, cities where there's a tax savings opportunity at the city level. But I think when we dug into it with individuals, the concern is more around, hey, are they going to know if I left the office at 4 p.m. and went, to somebody else's house? Or are they tracking and can see if I'm interviewing at Facebook when I'm working at Google and those sorts of things? But I think once you get it to a level of, one or two levels up from a granularity point of view, people understand there's actually personal risk, right, around that for getting it wrong, as well as risk to the employer. So I guess, Jacky, does that, did the results here surprise you, given all the conversation and concerns around this topic of Big Brother?
Sure. At first they did, but when I took a step back and actually really thought about it, they don't. So I think if we go back to the last slide, some of the gap of people reporting, there's definitely a component of folks that are scared of this Big Brother. But another aspect of this is people don't necessarily feel or have not felt the urgency or need to report it. They don't understand the why behind it. Matt, maybe that's you included, you said personally, so I think now, or even where they report it, right? Do I go to HR? Do I go to finance? Do I go to payroll? How do I go about doing this? So I think now we will see increasing understanding as to why we're doing that, mainly because we're hitting a year in this lockdown where, every country probably has hit a tax deadline, and people are going to start to understand also their personal obligations and implications of not working in certain places, asking questions. Can I write off, my home office equipment? I've worked from home for the majority of the year. So these bits are starting to come up for individuals. Now, back to the Big Brother piece, I think, again, it comes down to the why. To your point, as long as employers are clear of we're not tracking to spy on what websites you're going to, or that's not the intent of this. It's really around protecting us as an employer, potential cost savings, making sure we're compliant. Like, this is the part of doing business now that we need to get people comfortable with. And I think if employees understand that why, the data shows they're going to be okay with it. It's just really getting that spying mentality out of people's heads. And it comes down to communication again, and people understanding why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, and one of the sort of favorite anecdotes I had from over the year was talking with the CHRO, and by accident, they were very, very San Francisco tech. We're sending out new employee swag, so new sweatshirts to their employees. And they said, "Hey, can you please go into Workday and update your mailing address so we can make sure you get the sweatshirt to the right location?" And all of a sudden, this was 3-4 months into the pandemic. All of a sudden, all these employees, whether it's at a country or a state level, are in places that they were not supposed to be, and certainly payroll withholding wasn't being done for, et cetera. So that was, I think, a very eye-opening experience, done with actually not the intent to service that sort of information, but highlighted the size and scale of the challenge. Morgan, I think one of the things you touched on, a couple of points around the policy design and the technological challenge, right, of making sure that you can support and track and manage the policy. Does this this sort of insight that employees are maybe less scared of tracking than we thought make the case and the job easier for HR? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as I said before, the fear of not knowing where people are or not complying is getting in the way of people doing this as much as they would like to. So if they don't have to rely on the honor system and then have that fail and then clean up the mess that employees create, or they don't have to rely on communicating to everyone that this is actually an issue and please comply or else this is a fireable offense, like all of those things feel icky and bad to people. And if we can drop those barriers and just say, we're really excited as a company to be able to have a distributed workforce policy. And one of the things that will enable us to do that is to have a sense of where you are. That protects us, but it also protects you. It makes things a lot easier. And I mean, a really great case study of an employee who got themselves into trouble, and to protect the employee, they would want this to happen. An oil company brought an employee home from Angola, and they didn't go to Houston where there's no taxes. They went to California and ended up with an enormous tax bill, a personal income tax bill. So there's also, to Jacky's point about the why of it, the employee could get a benefit for not having surprises, or for, the employer could be proactive as well about helping them understand when they might be creating a personal tax liability. So I think there are benefits to the employees, but this definitely drops a barrier to making all of this happen, if we take the fear of the compliance risk away.
Yeah, and I think, we certainly counsel organizations as they're thinking about, tracking solutions, that it's an open, it's a transparent conversation, and it's actually, you'd be surprised at what you can overcome with a bit of that transparency. What is it? How's it going to be used? How's it going to be stored? Is it going to be secure? What can people see, et cetera? I think, we've seen even folks across Europe have success getting European Works Councils to approve tracking solutions, which, most folks, is like, that's a non-starter. There's no way that's happening. But I think with the right understanding and why we're doing it, you can come a long way. And certainly I think this year is going a long way to take us down that path. So before we open it up to some of the questions, I wanted to have a couple of closing thoughts here, and then we'll see what's come in over the last 45 minutes while we've been chatting. So I think to play back a lot of what I've heard, one, this new world of work is an interesting intersection and expansion of this world of global talent mobility, right? We've seen at the start of the pandemic, the first question was, where are my people? How do we get them home? Challenges that mobility had faced and supported for years, but now applying to a much wider and broader set of the population. And now, right, across any given year, certainly anybody's career, they're going to be mobile in some way, shape, or size at some point in time. And so the remit for mobility and HR certainly has widened and expanded, but with that comes a few headaches and challenges along the way. I think the one certainty here is flexibility is here to stay. Sure, there'll be some offices that organizations that mandate a 5-day work week. There'll be some that go fully remote. I think the vast majority of people will spend some time in the office on a regular basis, but what exactly that model looks like, how long commute times are, and whether they're flying in once a quarter or coming in once a week are still to be determined. But that flexibility is great in many senses. It adds a number of headaches and challenges and opportunities for us to get right as we go forward. I think it's, HR, finance, compliance have always had a tight relationship. I think this has forced that to be even tighter and stronger. I think the desire for a CFO to, reduce the facility costs in a world where, our offices are empty makes a lot of sense. Though it has to be tied to, Jacky, to a point you made around what's our talent strategy and what's the model that's right for our organization and for our employees. And then you layer on compliance on top of that. And I think shared data, shared technology and information flowing freely between tools is going to be key to stay on top of that and ultimately to be able to attract, develop, and retain top talent, which is, why we're all here helping organizations. And then, finally, the new world of work is incredibly exciting. Lots of opportunity, lots of risk that comes with that, right? No exciting opportunity comes without some challenges. And I think it's exciting to see how quickly organizations and HR teams have adapted and changed over the course of the year. I think at a pace that none of us would have expected to be able to sustain, which is great, exciting, and looking forward to see what comes next for everyone. So with that, I will open up to the floor. Holly, I'm not sure what questions have come in, but we've got a little bit of time left here and happy to take a few.
Yeah, so we've had a few. Morgan, I think this one's more geared towards you. How are you seeing companies think about salary adjustments when employees choose to move to lower cost locations?
Oh, wow, that's a very hot debate at the moment, and I think there's a lot of confusion out there as to what to do. Our latest survey about this, 32% of companies said if the employee requests to move to a different location, that they would adjust the pay up or down if there's a different rate of pay in that location. But that's only a third of companies that are doing that. And I think the big debate is it might actually benefit the company if the employee can take that higher rate of pay, say from the Bay Area, and go to Idaho and keep it. That might increase their employee retention. And some companies are also debating that maybe we are moving into a realm where we pay for the position and not the location, right? Maybe location is an outdated modality for determining pay. But that being said, we are seeing about a third of companies that will decrease the pay or increase it if you move. So the practice is really mixed, and I don't think we know what best practice will be. But my prediction is that we'll probably eventually emerge into more of a national pay structure within the United States rather than location-specific one. what it'll do to international comp, I think it will actually, you know, I was looking at the comp of a tech company the other day, and from their lowest paid country to their highest paid country for one position, there was a 7 times rate difference in what they paid the person just from one country to the next. And I think eventually we'll see, you know, salaries harmonize more than we will see people wanting to adjust them wildly in wild swings around the globe. So that's my thought on that question. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you. And then are you seeing organizations track all their employees or just certain populations?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. I think it's a great question. And certainly pre-COVID, there was a small subset of road warriors that were, you know, key risk, and therefore, you know, made sense to track them on a regular basis. I think we'll see in a somewhat similar fashion. I think we're seeing organizations with a sort of grouping of individuals based on their profile and their working model, right? So you may end up in certain industries, certain sectors with a decent portion of the employees back in the office like normal. No real need to track those beyond, you know, if people are starting to travel for business travel, whatnot. I think you'll have, you know, folks in a more of a medium risk bucket where they're, you know, they're going to be commuting across state lines. They're a more flexible working model, and therefore, you know, they're higher risk or opportunity. And then you will have this bucket of very senior execs, which generally carry with them more risk, particularly if we talk about activities that can create permanent establishment, road warriors with implications on state-to-state payroll withholding or cross-border payroll withholding. And I think then there's this other bucket that, you know, from a European perspective is a much wider percentage of the population now, which is as borders start to reopen and business travel begins again, you're going to have a population of folks from the UK traveling into the Schengen area with new compliance headaches that it didn't exist pre-Brexit. And also, finally, the European Posted Workers Directive, right, went into effect last year, and it wasn't quite the big bang that everybody maybe expected, given how limited travel has been. But we were already seeing a big uptake in organizations thinking about tackling those challenges, both from a pre-travel perspective, but then also after folks have traveled, tracking to make sure that the people are staying within day counts and whatnot. So I think, you know, there's a bit of a design portion to make sure you're tracking the right populations with the right tools and frequencies. But I expect, you know, for many organizations, certainly their knowledge workers that could be on the move, tracking to become a pretty standard affair in some way, shape, or size.
Great, thank you. And then we've just had another one come in. Despite the drive towards greater levels of flexibility, what do you see as the lasting global mobility perennial issues? Morgan, could you?
Do you mind reading that again, Holly?
Yeah, despite the drive towards greater levels of flexibility, what do you see as the lasting global mobility perennial issues?
Oh, so even though we're moving towards more flexibility, what will continue to be a challenge for global mobility is the way I hear that.
Yeah, I think so.
I think that the issues will just be that the service providers, the technology, everything is always struggling to catch up with where we're going, right? So we can design all sorts of really cool things for employees, but we need to make sure we have the right processes in place for that. So just like anything with mobility, it's really difficult to bring together all the providers and everybody in order to fall in line. And I think that we're sort of always playing catch up with that. So I think the perennial issue will be that mobility wants to do as much as it can, and it will have to challenge its network of providers to fall in line with it. I also think that a challenge will continue to be that we need to be more thoughtful about who we're sending on an assignment and why, and making sure that we're getting the right outcomes from our assignments and not being in a situation where we're lazy resourcing and make sure we pick the right people to go on assignment to begin with. So I think that those things will continue to be challenges, but they're kind of good challenges because it means we're all pushing the global mobility community to improve and embarking on this improvement process. So that, I hope I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, I think maybe just to add on a point there, I think we've always had a challenge across mobility of trying to do an awful lot with relatively small teams in many cases. I think if 2020 showed us anything, it piled on the demands, right? And new challenges, new populations, new policies, on top of already, in many cases, overloaded mobility teams. I think we've seen, and we'll continue to see that pressure continue. But I think it's been great to see the team sort of rise to that challenge, and also think about how do we redesign, whether it's process, people or technology, to better to support the new challenges. And I did see a note, Morgan, come in that you did understand the question, so that was the right one to answer.
Okay,
so
good.
Thanks for that. Yeah.
Great. Probably time for one last one then. Probably more for Matt or Jacky. How do you think about maintaining company culture and energy in a mostly remote environment?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think we talked about this a little bit. I think we have to shift money from, that we used to spend on stuff in the physical world to either things that are digital, or actually, the getting people together in person. I think there's more. I think this could be a boon for the offsite sort of industry, because I really think that like the way that you're going to connect, like the vision I have of our office is that, our people are coming together in the office to connect with one another, and that they're sort of doing a lot of their core individual work on their own, but coming together to connect, which we know drives better performance. We know that it removes barriers and it creates empathy and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it comes down to how you're engaging employees as well, and these bits of communication, right? So not everything can be a Zoom call. People have Zoom fatigue, right, at this case. So I've talked to what Matt just said, in places where teams are still near each other because they used to be in an office together. Do they get together in a park right now, weather permitting, and have a socially distanced lunch? So there are ways that folks are getting around this, and I think that's going to be important. Other bits is just rethinking, again, getting together a Zoom. Do you do a phone call one-on-one instead? Someone can shut off a video and engage them just through audio. So I think the culture, elements of the culture of a company are going to need to evolve with this, and people are going to, again, going back to kind of my talk track throughout this, every person is going to have their own needs of what they're looking for from their employer, their team, and the company as a whole. So we need to be ready to evolve with that as well.
That's great. And then I saw one last one coming here. Maybe Morgan, I'll throw your way. Do you see, with this sort of increase of remote working and flexible policies, do you see that as a trade-off versus maybe some of the traditional mobility policies, or sort of net new? So is mobility able to sort of shut down or move away from some of the traditional, or is this just on top of that world?
It's sort of on top of that world. We're going to still need expats to go to places and get work done, and especially in industries where there's manufacturing or highly collaborative or pharmaceutical, R&D, we're going to need people to go to locations and do those jobs. Also, when we need leaders to inspire people, we're going to need them to go and do those jobs. But, I saw the question pretty detailed that came in, and, what if that host location is predominantly work from home? Well, in that case, it's not a manufacturing location, it's not an R&D location, and you might end up with, what we're hearing are these sort of virtual types assignments where the person goes to that location, that gets to know the team, and maybe they fly in and out of that location from time to time. So what's going to happen, and I keep talking about this, the end of the policy, we're going to have lots of diverse ways that we can solve staffing needs, and we need to be flexible as mobility functions to be able to advise the business on the best way that we can help deploy the talent in the way that's going to get the work done. So this just makes us and elevates the role even further into this advisor status, because we'll need a spectrum of solutions to solve all of the different ways we can deploy talent.
Wonderful. Well, we're closing in on the end of time here. Thank you all for joining. A wonderful conversation. I'm sure we could talk for hours on the subject, and I think we just scratched the surface. I believe Holly will be sending along afterward to all the attendees a copy of the slides, the recording, as well as a link to the full ADAPT survey with a number of more additional stats and interesting tidbits on this new world of work. So with that, thank you all. Appreciate the time and see you soon.